Welcome, and thank you for joining our webinar today, a technical deep dive, Windows Server Remote Management using PowerShell and the Windows Admin Center, featuring guest speaker, IT and security expert Russell Smith. You're also joined by Beyond Trust product manager Jason Silva, who will run us through an overview of the PowerBroker for Windows product after our guest speakers portion, so please stick around for that. My name is Sarah. Hello, everybody. I'm your webinar host today. A reminder to please submit your questions via the GoToMeeting console anytime throughout the webinar, and we'll cover your questions during our Q&A time. So you'll see the console to your right, and just submit your questions anytime throughout the webinar, and I'll be monitoring those all throughout. Also, today's session is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email containing links to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 to 2 business days from now. And the slides can also be immediately downloaded via the handout section in the GoToWebinar console. Again, you'll find that in the console and in the handout section. Additionally, we now offer CPE credits through ISACA, and if you are attending for CPE credits and have an ISACA account, you can download the attendance verification document in the handout section now in order to submit proof that you attended today's session. This document will not be available post-webinar, so please download it now if you plan to submit your CPE credits to ISACA. And please note that you are responsible for reporting your own CPE hours earned. So at this point, let's hand it on over to Russell, who's going to jump right in. I know he's a lot to cover, so Russell, take it away, my friend.
Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction, and everybody, welcome to today's session. So just a little bit about me before I get into the main meat of today's webinar. So my name is Russell Smith, and I'm an independent IT consultant, and I specialize in managing and securing Windows Server. As well as doing these webinars for Beyond Trust, I also blog over at Netrix and for Lapide. And if you're interested in IT security, there's quite a lot of stuff in the Windows IT Pro archive. I've got a couple of courses over on Pluralsight, some Azure courses if you're interested, and I'm a regular blogger over at the Petri IT Knowledge Base. If you're specifically interested in the subject of least privilege security, I also have a book out, and you'll find lots of useful technical information about least privilege there, and you can get more information over at the publisher's website, which is Pact Publishing. Okay, so before we get started, I've got a question for everybody attending the webinar. So I want to know whether remote desktop is the primary server management tool in your organization. So if you use the little hands up icon on the GoToMeeting panel there, if that is the case in your organization. So I'll just give you maybe a few seconds to answer that question. Just want to get an idea of how many of us are using remote desktop for server management today. Okay, I can see quite a few hands going up there, quite a reasonable percentage of the attendees on the call. Okay, so today's webinar is going to be divided into 2 halves. So first of all, I'm going to talk about PowerShell Remoting because it's the most flexible of the 2 technologies. And then towards the end, I want to talk about the Windows Admin Center, which is a new tool for Microsoft. So it's kind of in its infancy, but it's a great tool, and I'll get onto that later in the webinar. And technically, it's also related to PowerShell Remoting, and you'll understand why as we move through the slides. I've got 2 demos for you today. I'm going to try and get through the slides as quickly as possible and onto the demos so that you can see these technologies in action. But first we need a little bit of conceptual understanding before we go on to look at remoting into Windows Server. So it might come as a surprise that PowerShell Remoting is actually the most secure way of managing Windows Server. Now, there's a lot of scare stories out there about PowerShell Remoting and how it's dangerous and how you should disable it and all of the rest of it. Of course, any tool that's used incorrectly could potentially be dangerous. But as long as you follow security best practices, as you can find laid out by Microsoft, PowerShell is actually the most secure way to manage your environment, and certainly is not inherently dangerous, of course. So why would we use PowerShell or PowerShell Remoting for that matter instead of using Remote Desktop? So I want to go through some of the reasons why you might not want to use Remote Desktop. So the first thing is that when you log into Remote Desktop session, that user can do anything that he's given privilege to do. And very often that privilege is an administrator. So that user can log in, they can do whatever they want, make whatever changes they want, and it's very difficult when using the GUI, the graphical user interface, to actually record and track what is happening in that user session. But what PowerShell Remoting allows us to do is give very granular access to users as they connect to Windows Server, and much more granular access than is possible than simply putting a user into a restricted group, for instance, like network operators or print server operators or something like this. We can give much more granular access than is possible using permissions. As I mentioned, as we connect to the server using PowerShell Remoting, as long as you've enabled it, we can log every single action that a user undertakes. Now, this is great, of course, for change control or for forensics if we need to understand what kind of change has been performed. And that information gets logged in two different places. It's logged in the Windows event log. So if you've got some kind of SIEM system, SIEM system, collecting all of the logs from your Windows server, that information will also be recorded and stored. And PowerShell Remoting also records a separate transcript of everything that happens in every user session. Now, of course, PowerShell Remoting, because it's part of Windows Server and it's built in, it's also compatible with other Windows Server technologies, including just-in-time access, where you give users access to the server only for the exact period of time for which they need access. Then that permission to remote into the server is revoked. And that's a technology in Windows Server 2016. But probably the best thing about PowerShell Remoting is that we can give users administrator access to a box without them ever needing to know that account password. And you'll see a little bit how that works as we go through the demo. So all of the access they get and all of the ability for PowerShell Remoting to run commands, not just against one server, but against potentially hundreds or even thousands of servers, makes this also very suitable for managing data centers or maybe servers that you have in the cloud, because you can type one command and have that action against a whole array of servers. Whereas with Remote Desktop, you would have to log into every single device and you would have to perform those actions manually. And there would be no record of what you have actually done as a user. So as you can see, this is great for really controlling your environment and understanding exactly what is happening, who is doing what, and when and where they are doing those things. So these are all pieces of information that you do not get when you use Remote Desktop. So there are some very common questions that I want to answer about PowerShell Remoting. And the PowerShell Remoting uses WinRM, which is Windows Remote Management. And this is a standard that's built into Windows Server, and by default it uses an HTTP listener. And starting in Windows Server 2012 R2, it's enabled by default. So PowerShell Remoting is enabled by default, as is the default listener. Now the first question is, well, it's not using HTTPS, so therefore it must be insecure. Well, it isn't insecure. Everything is encrypted over that HTTP connection. You don't need to add HTTPS in order to get encryption. And as long as you are using two devices that are members of an AD environment, Kerberos, which is the authentication mechanism used by AD, provides a mutual trust relationship between those two devices as well, preventing man-in-the-middle attacks. So you have all the basic security in place that you would expect. Now, the only case when that is different is if you're using machines in a work group. So, for instance, you're PowerShell remoting between two workgroup computers or from a computer that is not a member of your Active Directory domain, then you might want to consider using an HTTPS listener instead of the default HTTP one. And that's pretty easy to set up. Of course, you'll need a certificate to do that, but that's the only case when you really need to worry about using HTTPS instead of the default listener there. So I hope that kind of alleviates any concerns you might have about some of those basic security questions. So how does PowerShell Remoting actually work? So you establish a session from your management PC and you connect to an endpoint on Windows Server. Now, Windows Server by default has a default endpoint. And another security concern that people have is, well, in order to connect to that endpoint, I need to be an administrator, and maybe we don't want to give our users administrator privileges. Well, okay, that is true. If you want to make a connection to the default endpoint, then you will need to be either a member of the administrators group or the remote management users group. And when you connect to this endpoint, you can do whatever you want. You have access to all of PowerShell's commandlets and modules and functions, and it's an open session for you to do whatever you want. And that is the default endpoint. So if you're going to establish a session, it could look something like this. So if you have a look on the screen there, you can see that I'm connecting with the credential AD-admin1. So this is a user account that's a member of the local administrators group on the remote server. And I'm basically running the winrm quick config command to set up Windows Remote Management on a machine where it's been disabled. And I'm using the invoke command, PowerShell commandlet, in order to run that script block, if you like, which is just one line of code that I have there. So it's pretty easy to make a remote session into Windows Server, and you can also have an interactive session, which I'll show you as part of the demo. So what about connecting without administrator privileges? Well, the great thing is with PowerShell Remoting that it has also a technology called Just Enough Administration built into it. And Just Enough Administration allows you to basically define your own endpoints. So you can determine what rights the user needs in order to connect to the server. So if you have a look at the slide here, you can see that I've added there groups any. So you can decide, well, actually even just a particular user. If you wanted, I want to allow just this user or just this group of users to connect to this Windows Server endpoint. They don't have to be administrators on the local box. As well as that, as well as deciding which groups you want to be able to connect to this endpoint, you can also restrict the access they have to PowerShell commandlets, modules, and functions. So for instance, you can say, oh, yeah, I only want these users to be able to run the restart service commandlet, but absolutely nothing else. Or you could, for instance, say, no, I want them to have access to a particular module, maybe the DNS server module, for instance, and they can run all commandlets and functions that are part of that PowerShell module. And you can make it as restricted or as open as you want. Now, there are two ways users can connect to the endpoint. They can connect using their own account, so they will provide their own username and password. And when they connect to the remote server, they will action any commands on the remote server under their own username and their own user account. So they will need permission, for instance, to restart a service if that's how they're connecting to the endpoint. But you can also set up endpoints so that users enter their own username and password, but on the remote server, all the actions and commands that they run are run elevated as a local administrator. And this is called a virtual just enough administrator account. So what's great about this, of course, is it allows them to connect to the box, run whatever commands they have access to as a local administrator, but they never need to know a local administrator username or password in order to do that. Okay, so just bear in mind that there are two different ways users can get access to that box through a constrained endpoint that you configure. Okay. So there are a couple of things before we go on to the demo part that we need to discuss. So in order for PowerShell Remoting to log all of the commands that a user undertakes on the remote device, you need to enable that login in group policy. So it's not enabled by default, so you need to remember that. If you want to go looking for those logs, then of course you will find them in the Windows event log. You can see there under Microsoft Windows PowerShell in the operational folder. And most of the useful information you'll find in event IDs 4103 and 4104. And I'll show you that in the demo. You can also see as part of that information not just what the user undertook, what actions they run against the server, but you can also see the connecting user, so who actually connected to that endpoint, and then the run as user. And what that means is, did those actions run under a virtual administrator account, or did those actions run under the user's own account? And you can see that information as well. Now, the login is very comprehensive with PowerShell Remoting, and not only do you get all of that information in the Windows event log, you can also configure your endpoint to create a transcript of all the commands and actions that are undertaken and save that information into a directory. So, there are 5 steps to setting up your own constrained endpoint. So the first step is to create a role capability file. And in this file, we decide what capabilities we're going to allow the connecting users to have. Okay, and all that information sits in a separate file. I won't talk about this too much here because I think it's better just to show you. Once we've determined what roles we want those users to have, what capabilities we're going to assign to those roles, we need to register a PowerShell module that has a role capabilities folder, and we put that file, that PSRC file, into that folder. And then PowerShell can reference that file in order to pull out the necessary role and capabilities for each PowerShell endpoint that we configure. So once that folder is created, that role capabilities folder, we just copy that file into the folder. That's relatively simple. And then we can go on to create a session configuration file, which determines who is allowed to connect to our endpoint, which groups and users, and which roles will be assigned to that particular endpoint. And finally, we just need to test that configuration file. Does it meet Microsoft's syntax? And then we register an endpoint using that session configuration file. Now, it all sounds a little bit complicated, so don't worry, you'll hopefully get a clearer understanding during the demo of how this actually works in practice. Okay, so just give me a couple of seconds and I'm going to switch over to a virtual machine, which I have prepared here. And just wait for your screen to update. And hopefully there you can see my server desktop. Now, at the moment here, I have open, this is a domain controller, I should just explain. Not a best practice to do all of this stuff on a domain controller, but for the sake of the demo, it's just the quickest way to do it today and to show you how it works. I'm logged on as a domain administrator, so I can do anything I want on this device at the moment. Now I've started by creating a security group in Active Directory. And you can see here on the screen, it's called JEA, so that's Just Enough Administration, DC Operators. So I want to create an endpoint on this domain controller, which is going to allow certain actions only on this particular domain controller. And anybody who is a member of that group, if I open that now and click on members, you can see I have an account there called Russell. It's the only member of that group, but any member of that group will have access to the endpoint that I'm about to configure. So I'm going to cancel out of that, and I'm going to close ADUC for a minute. And now what you can see on the screen is the Windows PowerShell integrated scripting environment. Basically, this is an editor for PowerShell that's built into Windows Server, and it just allows me to get a color-coded here display of the PowerShell script, so that's easier to read for you. And I'm going to walk you through setting up the constrained endpoint. So the first thing that I need to do, if you remember from the previous slide, is I need to create a file that contains the roles and capabilities that I want to assign to my new endpoint. And I'm going to do that in the first section of the code here. So I'm going to highlight the first variable here. And what I'm defining here is a hash table that will configure this endpoint to allow using the restart service commandlet. There are some important things here to note. Not just will these people be able to use restart service, but they will only be able to specify as part of the name parameter the DNS or the spooler service. So you can see how granular it can really be. It's not just I'm going to say, okay, you can use the restart service commandlet. You can only restart these two services. So that's really important to note. And I've also added, just so you can see how it works, get process. But as you can see, it doesn't have all the same options. It doesn't have a hash table. It's just a simple get process there is declared. There's no extra information there because I'm going to say, okay, you can run get process and you can do whatever you like with it. I'm not going to put any restrictions on that particular commandlet. So we have two commandlets there. Restart service. It's very restricted what you can do with it. Just basically restart the DNS and spooler service. And I've also given my users their get process. And this is basically, well, okay, you can do whatever you like. In the next variable, you can see they're called visible external commands. Now, this is for anything that is not a PowerShell commandlet. And I'm going to allow my users to run the Who Am I application so they can see and prove who are they actually logged on as when they connect to this endpoint. Okay. Now I'm going to create this new role file using the new PS role capability file commandlet. And all I need to do here is specify a file name. So the name of the role is DC operator, so domain control operator. And I've specified the variables that I've created above. So I'm just going to select all of that code and I'm going to run it. And you can see the output there in the bottom of the window. So that has now created a file. And if I look here, I can see DC operator. And I'm just going to open that up. And let's have a quick look at that file, and you can see there's lots of stuff there that we don't need because it creates a skeleton file. But the most important parts are here. You can see that it's created this section in the file, and we can see there the restart service commandlet. And if I come down here, I can see the visible external commands, and there we also have who am I, and also I forgot to mention here get process as well. That all looks fine to me. So now we have our role capability file. Now the next section is a little bit more complicated, where I need to create a PowerShell module. I'll just quickly tell you what that does. So basically this little section of code creates a new folder under program files for the new module. And here basically all I'm going to do is create a empty script module and module manifest. That's all I need to do here. The module itself doesn't actually have to perform any functions. I just need to have that module in place. And finally, I need to add a role capabilities folder to that module, which is what this little section of code does. And I copy the file that we've just created into that role capabilities folder. And that file just has to be in that folder, and that folder has to be part of a registered PowerShell module before you can use it. So that's a little bit complicated, but that's what that code does. Now I've already created that module and folder on this device, so I'm not going to run that code, but it is relatively simple and it works pretty much as described on the tin. So now that our role capabilities file and folder and module is all in place, all that's left to do is create a session configuration file, which we will use to register the new constrained endpoint. So the main important part of this is to define, well, who is going to get access and what roles do they have. So basically, I need to add, as you can see here, the role and the Active Directory group. So we've already created a role called DC operator, which is in our file that we just created. And I want people who are a member of the JEA DC operators group to have access to that DC operator role. And it's as simple as that. And you can see I've defined that in a roles variable. And all that's left to do is to pump that information into the new PS session configuration file, commandlet. Now there are various parameters there. Let me just explain them quickly. So session type you can see is set to restricted remote server. And basically what that does is limit the default access to PowerShell. So you have access just to do a couple of basic things like run get command, run get help, just do a couple of things there and nothing else. You can't run script blocks, you can't do anything fancy. And that helps us protect the server. I want the connecting users to log in as their own account. They have to do that, but once they're connected to the server, I want everything running as a virtual GEA administrator. So it will create this virtual account on the fly just for this session. The user will get to run as a local administrator, even though they don't have local administrator privileges on this box. And once the session is disconnected, that virtual local administrator account will be destroyed. Moving on, I want all the transcripts for this session to be logged into the transcripts directory on the server. And the role definitions I've already defined in the roles variable. And the final parameter there is path, which means this is where I want you to put the session configuration file into the working path, which is users administrator, as you can see below. So I already have the file, but I can just create it again. So I'm going to select that and run it. And if I come over to my administrator folder, you can see that file has been created. I'll just open it up quickly there so you can see it. And you can see there that we have session type restricted remote server. And what else do we have? And we have the run as virtual account set to true, and everything else that we need there should be in place. Okay. So if I look at that file correctly, I see that I've made a mistake because there are actually no role definitions in that file, and that's going to cause us a problem. So why that mistake? Because I guess I hadn't selected and run this, which was quite important. That roles variable with our role definitions. So I'm going to pick this out again and run this again. If I close this and reopen it, hopefully you can see now at the bottom I have my role definitions. So it was very important that I selected all the code that was necessary. Okay, so that all looks fine to me. So now we have the session configuration file. I should test it, make sure the syntax is correct. So I'm just going to use that test configuration file commandlet, and we should get back true if everything is correct. And let's register it. So I'm going to register that now. So this is creating that constrained endpoint on the device from the session configuration file. So I'm just going to run that. It'll maybe just take a couple of seconds to complete. There you go. And you can see that has created the remote endpoints. And if I now run get PS session configuration, I should see all the endpoints on this device. So I can see all the default ones that are there out of the box. And I can see now this new endpoint, sorry, DC operator, you can see there, and who is allowed to access this. Anybody who is a member of that Active Directory group. Okay, so now this is where we need to test it. So you can see here that I'm going to use the enter PS session commandlet. I'm doing this on the local computer just so I don't have to swap to another computer, but you can do it from any remote computer that isn't obviously blocked by a firewall to this computer. The computer name is there, so this is, well, actually the local computer, but that's not really important. I need to specify the name of the constrained endpoint that I'm connecting to, well, it's DC operator, and the credentials. I'm using AD Russell. This is just a standard domain user. I don't have any special privileges on this box. So I'm going to run that piece of code. And you can see now it's asking for my password. So I'm going to type in my password. And now you can see the prompt there has changed to indicate that I'm in a remote session. Even though I'm actually on this box, it's connected as a remote session. So what do I want to do? Well, let's see what we can actually do in this remote session. So let's see what commands are available to us. And you can see there are a few. So you can see there that there are just a few default ones. And then we get the restart service and get process, which we added as part of the role capabilities. An external command that I added was who am I, if you remember. It's not a PowerShell command, but it's an external command. And you can see there that I am actually running now in this remote session as a virtual administrator. So I didn't connect with an administrator account. I was a standard domain user, but here I am actually a domain administrator on this box, even though I don't have any domain admin privileges as AD Russell. So let's check, can we run get process? We should be able to, yes. So you can see there we now have a list of processes running on the box. Okay, that's great. Let's try to run something else. Maybe I want to list the directory contents. Can't do that. No, shouldn't be able to do that. Change directory. No, can't do that either. Well, that's exactly as it should be because those commands were not specified. I should be able to restart the DNS service. Let's see if we can do that. Yep, seems that I can. Let's restart the spooler service. Yep, seems that I can. But what about restarting some other service? So let me type restart service DHCP, for instance. No, can't do that because I didn't specify that as one of the services that this endpoint was allowed to restart. So you can see that's very, very restricted to what I can do. But if I need to configure an endpoint where I just have a specific set of capabilities, this technology is perfect for that. So let's go and have a look in the event log and see what's going on. So I've already set up a custom view here just to make it faster. And we should at some point, if I scroll, there'll be lots of information here that we have to scroll through to get what we want because it's very verbose. But I should find here, you see there already. If I open this event, you can see that somebody used the restart service commandlet and they restarted the spooler service. And if I come down and scroll further down in this event, you can see who did it. So you can see that the user on the remote box was actually this virtual account, but the user that connected and authenticated was actually AD Russell. Okay, so that's really important that we have that information, not just about the virtual account, but who actually connected to this remote endpoint. So you can see there's tons and tons of information there about what happened during this session that you would never have with a remote desktop. Okay. And just very quickly, if I come across to this PC and users, the administrator folder, no, sorry, not there, the C drive. There should be a folder called transcripts, and I also have there a transcript of what is going on. So you can see there I connected at this time. And if I look through all of that, I should be able to find restart service. And there you can see restart service is be listed there a couple of times. So this is what we really want. So anything under command evocation is something that was actually run as part of this session. So you can see lots and lots of information about what is actually happening when users connect to my constrained endpoints. Okay. So I think that I've told you everything that's really important there. Very rapidly running out of time, so I want to move quickly on to the Windows Administrator Center, the Windows Admin Center. So let's come back to the slides. And I'll just quickly mention that there's a tool called the GEA Helper tool that you can download from Microsoft for free that helps you to create the role capability file, the session configuration file, and register and test endpoints without having to do any coding if you want. My option is always to understand it from a coding point of view because it helps you with a deeper understanding, but we do have this tool as well, which allows you to define all of that kind of stuff. So why am I talking about the Windows Admin Center as part of this session? Because it's quite closely related to what I've just shown you, and that'll become clear in a second. So the Windows Admin Center is a new tool. Microsoft have already said this is the future of GUI server management in Windows. So why would we want to use this tool? Because we have other tools. We have remote desktop connection. We have the remote server administration tools as well, which people sometimes use for remote management. So the problem with these tools are that they're not very user-friendly. They've been around since Windows 2000, haven't changed very much. They weren't very user-friendly then, and they still aren't. They don't use, most of them don't use PowerShell. There are a couple of exceptions. So you don't get all of that fantastic login that we get with PowerShell Remoting. They also use remote procedure calls in order to connect to a remote server, which means it's really difficult to make them work across a firewall. They're not designed for distributed and cloud environments like PowerShell Remoting is, and they're missing some tools like Task Manager, which is really important for getting an overview, a quick overview of the current health of your server. So there's a couple of reasons there why the remote server administration tools have never really been that ideal a solution. Now, the Windows Admin Center, I'll show you in a minute, it's basically a web-based portal which gives you access to all of the basic configuration needs of Windows Server, including Task Manager. What I want to focus on here is a little bit about how that relates to PowerShell Remoting, because it uses the same technology in order to provide role-based access control. And there are 3 roles that you can have as part of the Windows Admin Center. So administrators, readers, and Hyper-V administrators. This is all a little bit confusing, unfortunately, because you can connect to the Windows Admin Center as a full administrator on the box and have absolute control over that box, or you can connect as one of these role administrators, which is almost an administrator, but not quite an administrator. So it gives you access to do quite a lot, but it doesn't give you access to things like PowerShell through this tool. It doesn't give you access to remote desktop, so it is a little bit restricted if you use this administrator's role. But it's different from connecting with your actual administrator credentials. A little bit confusing that. This is all based on the PowerShell GEA technology, which I've just shown you, this role-based access control. It's not as flexible as PowerShell Remoting in terms of you have these 3 available roles, and Microsoft, that's all Microsoft support. You can't create your own custom roles with capabilities like we just did with PowerShell Remoting. But hopefully sometime in the future, Microsoft will change that. So let's have a look at the Windows Admin Center, and I'll just show you where all of that role-based configuration is. So I need to switch to, again, another virtual machine. And I hope that it's still working. I just need to connect to it. Give me 1 second. And I'm just going to log on to it as the local administrator. And okay, I'm just going to come back to the home page here. So that domain controller where I was configuring the constrained endpoint is listed here. And it's actually this machine that's last in the list. And for just to expedite today's session, I'm going to connect as the domain administrator. And you can see here I can control which user account I connect with. It's not a problem to do that there. And I'm going to connect. Hopefully that will connect. So now I'm connected to that domain controller that we were just configuring. And you can see there, well, basically something very similar that you get with Task Manager. So you can see CPU utilization, Ethernet, memory, total disk space, free disk space, the processors, and all sorts of information there that you would expect to see in the system control panel applet or in Task Manager. And there's a whole load of other stuff that you can configure. You can get access, of course, to the event logs, because that's going to take a little bit of time because I'm on very slow VMs here. Let's just wait for it to load up. It's chugging along. Okay, I'll go to something that's a little bit faster to load. Let's have a look at the firewall configuration. Hopefully that will load up a bit faster. There you can see the firewall profiles there. I can go to the domain profile and let's have a look at that. The incoming rules. And there you can see all of the incoming rules, and you can create new ones, disable the existing ones, do all sorts of things there. I don't have time to go through all of these things, but again, you've got services here. This is all working off PowerShell Remoting and Windows Remote Management. And you can see all of the services there, and I can stop and start and do everything that I'd expect to do. Let's come to overview again. So I just want to show you the role-based access control. So if I come to settings, and give that a second, and you can see here that I have role-based access control. And you can see there the 3 different groups. So we have administrators, Hyper-V administrators, and readers. And what happens is when you click apply, it goes off to that remote device and it creates a PowerShell endpoint, which provides those strict role capabilities that Microsoft have already defined. And it also creates these groups on the box. So if I go over to my domain controller now, I would find a group called Windows Admin Center Administrators. And all I need to do is place, for instance, the AD Russell account into that group, and then I can connect using the Windows Admin Center, not using the domain administrator account, but using the AD Russell account, for instance. And it does something very similar to the PowerShell demo that I just showed you. It uses a virtual administrator account, and it gives me access to do things that I wouldn't usually have to do, be able to do under that Russell account, because it's just a standard domain user. It's also important to note that you can control access to the gateway as well. So I can control who has access to this gateway. It's very easy to install. You can install it on one device and then access other computers. And because it's based on Windows Remote Management and PowerShell Remoting, it doesn't need any special technology to work. It doesn't need any agents. It just goes off across that HTTP connection and works magically and does everything that you would expect it to do, with all of that granular control and security available to you. Okay, I'm going to quickly go back to the slides. I'm very aware that I'm very quickly running out of time. There are some disadvantages to the Windows Admin Center as it stands right now. You don't have things like Active Directory users of computers or DHCP tools. As I said, the role-based access control is limited. You can't define your own roles as it stands at the moment. There's no support for things like Exchange and SQL, and it doesn't store any historical performance information or configuration information and stuff like that. Okay, I've really covered a huge amount in the last 50 minutes. I hope that wasn't too much and you at least get an idea of how all that works and how you can really make these PowerShell constrained endpoints very locked down, very secure, but also very flexible at the same time. So I'm going to hand over to Jason and he's going to give you a demo.
All right, thank you. Russell, just make sure you can hear me okay?
Yep, that's good.
And which screen are you seeing? You should see a PowerShell screen.
I can see your PowerShell ISC.
Okay, great. So with the time allowed, I just want to really quickly touch on what PowerBroker for Windows is. It's a tool around least privilege. So the idea, just like what Russell was saying, is don't log into the box as a standard user, but I understand there's a lot of things that you need to do, whether you be a day-to-day user or a system admin or whatever it might be, that actually require admin rights. So let's create a set of rules or policy that says when Russell or when Jason runs this application, then let it run as it should, whether that means just putting more rights into the security token of a local application, or if it means actually running an application as another user. Again, similar to what Russell was showing. But as you see here, I have a PowerShell script that's just going to go grab some services from a remote host, and I'm not going to be able to do it. I can't do it because I don't have those rights. Those rights are needed on the remote host. So rather than going through and setting up JEA for everything I need to do, which I don't want to devalue what it actually brings, but I like to work a little bit faster with some things. So I'm going to come out of this, and I'm going to enable a rule. The rule simply says, look, if you do this, go ahead and launch it as a different user. This user happens to have an ADM account associated with them. The person who actually owns the username doesn't have to know what the credentials are, because we'll go ahead and we'll manage the credentials of those users. But when it launches, I want that to happen. If I wanted to limit who actually is in scope for a rule like this, I'll use the item level targeting. If you're familiar with group policy preferences and item level targeting, it's the same stuff. We actually made item level targeting. Microsoft bought that from us when they bought group policy preferences from us. So I'm going to enable that. I'm going to go ahead and update my policy. I want the client, the PowerBroker for Windows client, to understand that this rule now exists. So the next time that I run either PowerShell or ISE Or if it's just a script directly, I could elevate just a single script as well. Then I wanted to know that I want something different to happen than just happened before when it wasn't working. So let me give this just a moment to reach out and go understand that I just enabled those policies. Make sure I did good. All right, so now the policy is updated. I'm calling the same thing. And again, for ease of use, I'm just using the full breadth of PowerShell here. But again, I could just do it as an elevation of a single script if I wanted to. So that same thing that just didn't run works perfect. And if I wanted to add into it and I wanted to say, you know what, I want you to go ahead and start up one of these services. So the screen that I'm looking at is a little bit further away. That's my start. Good. Go ahead and run it, right? So, what the heck? I'll comment that side out again and run it, just so you can see. Windows Audio Service is no longer listed as a stop service. Again, very simplistic. It's just a Windows Audio Service. But whatever this particular script or any application really, if it needed more elevation than a standard user could have given it, all I need to do is provide a rule for it. There's a set of reporting that comes along with it in the time allotted. I don't really have the time to get into some of the stuff here, but there's a set of reporting and centralized event management that says, here's what this one user is doing, here's what this group of users are doing, here are the things that if they still have admin rights are most likely to break when you take them away. So you can actually build up those set of rules prior to removing anybody's admin rights, and then go ahead and put those in place. All right, so I do want to respect time. Sarah, I believe you have some Q&A. I'm sure there's a lot based on what Russell was going through, because that was a lot of cool information. So I will let you actually go ahead and do that now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jason. Okay, guys. So I know it was a really fast demo on Jason's part. So, but that's totally cool because, you know, we like to focus on our experts during these webinars. So I'm going to launch a poll. You should see it pop up on your screen. And if you would like to schedule a more thorough, personalized one-on-one demo with a Beyond Trust security expert, they can walk you through more features with any of our PowerBroker products or even our Retina vulnerability management product, please select yes, and then somebody will be in contact with you, and you guys can have the longest conversation that you want to have and demo that you'd like to have and experience with our products. So I'm going to leave this up. Let's jump into a couple of questions. Okay, let's see. We had a bunch come in, so let me just make sure I start at the top. Russell, I don't seem to have any success actually running the Windows Admin Center. I'm a local admin on PCs, but not a domain admin. Any thoughts here?
Well, it depends what you're trying to connect to, basically. Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't be able to connect to a domain controller without being a domain admin unless somebody has configured a role-based access control on that domain controller, for instance.
Jason, this is for you. Make sure you're off of mute. How do we use Beyond Trust Password Safe with those administrations practices?
Oh, so Password Safe is what's actually managing the credentials. So all you need to do is tell Password Safe that there's a user that exists that you want to cycle the password for, manage the password for, and then associate that with the devices that you want to use PowerBroker for Windows on. There's actually a way to automate all of that as well. And the rule that says to do this is pretty simplistic as well. Let me show you that. I think I'm still sharing. So you can see here.
Oh, here, 1 second, Jason. Let me close the poll real quick.
Oh, thank you.
And then we'll be able to see it. And there you go.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm just telling PowerBroker for Windows, rather than just elevate the application's token in like internally or locally, I want you to actually reach out to Password Safe, because Password Safe is going to be managing the credentials of the account that I put here. And in this case, like I said, I put it as a one-to-one. The user that's logged in, she's the only person that would have access to use this account. And if it was a different user, that's why I use the variable name. It would be a different one. I could also just use a shared account. If I had a group of help desk people and I wanted to use shared help desk account one, you can do that as well. I tend to like to do it this way. It's just my preference for it. But as long as Password Safe is managing it, PowerBroker for Windows can reach up and go grab it without exposing what the password actually was. At no time did you actually see the password be displayed to me.
Russell, so the .psrc is a whitelist only?
Yes.
Okay, next question. Russell, if we're dropping it into the role capabilities folder of a registered module, does that mean you would need a role file for each module we want them to have access to? For example, if we want them to access some functions of the MSOL module and the Azure AD module and the DNS module.
No, not at all. The role capability file just has to be, and the folder in which it's contained just has to be part of any PowerShell module. It's not related to what modules you're actually given access to through that role capabilities file. It just has to be part of a registered PowerShell module. It's in no way related to what actual capabilities you're granting through that file. It's all very confusing the way it works, but no. That's not the case.
Russell, what module do you have to have loaded, installed, imported in order to have the CMDlets for managing JEA?
Nothing. It's all there by default. At least as long as you're using, I don't know when GEA came in, but in PowerShell 5, it's all there. You don't need to have anything specifically imported or loaded from a module standpoint. It all just works, as I showed you today, without any having to import this module or that module. It all just works out of the box.
I think that this question is for Russell, but Michael, who submitted it, you maybe clarify, or maybe Russell or Jason will know. Can you manage PCs as well as servers? Thanks.
You mean with the GEA? I've never tried to manage a PC using it, but I know maybe Jason knows. I don't know,
Yeah,
but I guess that you can, but I've never tried.
Yeah,
So.
I could imagine you can't do it, but I think that the question was for Russell. But I'll take a little bit of it. I don't have a problem with a server or a client. It's a Windows box to me is a Windows box, right? All that matters is what is it you tried to do.
Okay, next question. How did you launch the WAC? For example, what URL did you use, and how do I determine that in my own environment?
So it's just actually it was running on that box that I logged into. So the actual website was running on that box. So basically, it comes as an installer. It doesn't require IAS. It just runs as a standalone package. And when you install it, it creates a link on the desktop. And it's just a web link, basically. It's a URL that connects to the local web service that it's installed, running on that box. And when you open that, when you double click on that link, it opens up Windows Admin Center, and you'll be able to see in the browser window the URL that you would need to connect to it from another box, for instance. Hope that makes sense.
Jason, for you, so does PBWin duplicate JEA or complement it or leverage it?
Complements it. I wouldn't say it leverages it. It wouldn't get in its way. JEA allows you to say, look, there's 10 commandlets, right? We talk about PowerShell, and then we talk about what you're doing inside there. JEA actually lets you get down to that level of saying you can do commandlet A and C, but I'm not going to allow for B, D, and E, right? PowerBroker is more of a process-driven thing, so I am allowing for all of PowerShell itself to be elevated if you need that, or individual scripts. You can sign those scripts and only allow those signed scripts to actually be launched. But JEA would actually let you get down to one commandlet out of all of PowerShell. So I won't get in its way. I'll complement if you are using that, but most times, if you're using that, you might just go ahead and use that for those tasks. But it's probably something at least to look at to say, look, I don't want to use one security model for this for these tasks and a different one for these tasks. So I would suggest at least looking into PowerBroker Windows because it's going to handle it all for you.
For Russell, how does encryption work over HTTP connection when you have talked about the default listener? Use of some other layer?
Yes, it does. It uses another layer, and you don't have to apply an HTTPS listener to get that encryption.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Russell, is there a minimum PowerShell version endpoints need to be running for any of what was demoed today?
Yeah, everything that was demoed today, you need to be running whatever the latest version of PowerShell 5 is, Windows Management Framework, sorry. So the Windows Management Framework needs to be installed on those remote endpoints where you're creating those constraint endpoints, and whatever the latest version is, I don't know, is it 5 point something?
Russell, what versions, I think this is for you. What versions of Windows Server or PowerShell support role capability files and JEA?
Well, again, it's connected to the Windows Management Framework. So as long as you have the latest framework installed on your server, then it will support it. And I think the Windows Management Framework 5 point whatever it is supports whatever Microsoft still supports in terms of Windows Server. Does that make sense?
Okay, last question. What versions of Windows Server can be administered from the WAC?
I think starting from Windows Server 2012.
I believe you're correct there. Yeah.
Upwards,
Yeah.
I think, yes.
Yeah, they've been working on that for a while. So I think they
yeah.
were. I saw some demos of Honolulu, which is what it was called.
Yeah.
Back in 2012.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Holy guacamole. Thanks, everybody, for all of your questions. That was awesome. I did receive a couple of questions also asking about the recording and the slides. So yes, the slides are available in the handout section right now, so you can download them. And we will also be emailing you guys a follow-up that includes the recording and the slides shown here today. So be on the lookout for that. It will come from communications@beyondtrust.com. And also just a reminder that if you are reporting your CPE credits to ISACA, to download the attendance verification document now. Again, it is in the handout section. Russell, Jason, thank you guys so much. I know we ran over a couple of minutes, but I really appreciate everybody sticking around, and thanks for cramming a lot of information into 60 minutes. We really appreciate you guys and your expertise. And again, thanks everybody for being here today, and have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll see you guys at our next webinar. Take care.
Thank
and
you.
goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
guys. Bye-bye.